on, you guys can relate. This is now, besides Sydney and Hong Kong, the third most expensive city in the world. And it's because of real estate. The housing market here is a little bit crazy. The average one bedroom, and you guys are from Sydney as well, the average one bedroom in this city goes for over $700,000. In this neighborhood, the average one bedroom goes for last year $864,000. And sadly, this is not the most expensive neighborhood in the city. It's a little crazy. If you came out here in the mid-1980s, it was a completely different place. Yaletown used to be very industrious. There was a lot of warehouses out here. This is where you had a couple different lumber yards and sawmills and whatnot in the area. And what transformed this neighborhood is a very random thing that it's kind of hard to put your finger on, but when Hong Kong went back to China, and there was a few people in Hong Kong at the time that, knowing that they were going back to mainland China, were kind of scared of losing their fortunes. They'd acquired all this money under capitalism, and they didn't want to go back to a communist country and lose their fortunes, so a few individuals came here to Vancouver and they started buying up land in this industrious zone, and they completely transformed it. So almost everything you see around you, this is all residential. It's one of the more densely populated residential areas in Canada. This city's kind of been developed through a couple different major events, like the World Fair took place here back in 1986, and in 2010 obviously we hosted the Olympic Games. So you can actually see the stadium where the opening and closing ceremonies were held on the left there. And actually just before the Olympic Games, the year that we were supposed to host the games, the roof actually collapsed. It used to be like one of those air bubble roofs, and so they changed it. They built that roof there, which actually is a retractable roof, so it can open and close. So that's the biggest roof in the world that's retractable. You can see that there's these apartment buildings on our left here. These are what was called the Olympic Village. It still is. And the idea behind these apartments, these first three that all kind of look the same, is they built them for the athletes to live in. And the idea was that as soon as the athletes were done, you know, the Olympic Games were done, they would just sell those places. And because the housing market was so hot, they kind of figured that they could sell them in a week. The last of those places sold in 2016, took over 6 years, and the guy who bought the last 40 units was the guy who was also the main developer. So the places were a failure. The reason that it took so long was that apparently the company that was doing the construction went bankrupt, and they ended up cutting a bunch of corners, so those places actually didn't insulate against heat. They didn't insulate against noise, so you could hear everything your neighbors are doing, but most importantly, they didn't insulate against water. And this is a very, very wet place. We get twice as much rain as London, England does. This is a temperate rainforest, so it rains here all the time. We have to head south towards the US border, and where we're going to be taking the ferry from is right on the border of the United States, a little place called Tsawwassen. So there's 3 different roads that all run to the south. This is one of them. It's called Cambie Street. I was talking to Phil earlier, and he was talking about that he took the train from Toronto all the way across to Vancouver here. When they were building that train, they had to go through the Rocky Mountains. And at the time, there was a lot of people that said it was impossible. So they created an open contract. They said that whoever created the best route for that train would be given the contract, plus a huge reward of $1 million. And the guy who actually came up with the best route, his name was Henry Cambie. This street's named after him. This is our city hall on the left side here, and this city hall was built in the 1930s, right in the middle of the Great Depression, and the city was going through a hard time, and the guy who was the mayor at the time, he was this very extravagant, kind of over-the-top character, and he built this very beautiful city hall. And it got huge amounts of protest. People didn't want to spend all this money on the city hall, and they couldn't see why it was necessary. In the eyes of the mayor, the city needed like a serious rejuvenation. The image of Vancouver at the time wasn't very positive. We'd had one American president come to visit, and that was Warren Harding. He'd come to visit. He was on his way down from Alaska, and he'd given this epic speech down on Georgia Street. There was thousands of people there to cheer him on, and he gave this speech, and everything was going great. The city thought that they were doing a great job of hosting this guy. Then he went and played a round of golf, got pneumonia, and died. So we were the city that killed the president. Basically, we kind of got this reputation as having this atrocious weather. You know how it is. Canadians live in igloos. Not really the case out here. It's a pretty mild climate, just a lot of rain, but it doesn't get particularly cold. On a normal year, we might have 1 or 2 days of snow in the actual city of Vancouver. The mountains around the city get a lot of snowfall, but down here it's pretty mild. It's kind of cool that this street is named Canby Street after the guy who kind of invented the train through the Rocky Mountains, because nowadays there is a train that actually runs underneath this street. So if you take the train out to the airport or to Richmond, it comes through here. And very intuitively, it runs underground. They call it the SkyTrain. And when they were building it, they actually had to tear up the street completely in order to put the train down there. So all the sidewalks were torn up, the streets were torn up. For about 2 years, these businesses suffered terribly. Didn't have much business, you can imagine. So they actually came together and they formed a petition to the city in order to be bought out for 2 years of losses, and they were actually paid by the city, which helped them stay in business. And nowadays, because there's so much more traffic coming through here, they do quite well. So normally, kind of the farther south that you get out of the city, the more affordable it becomes. But you got to kind of take that with a grain of salt, because more affordable for most people in the world in Vancouver is not affordable, and it's been changing recently. So in recent times, it's been this part of the city that's developing the quickest. So up ahead, you're going to get a bit of a taste of that. The reason is that historically, it's all single-family homes in this area, and these single-family homes are no longer sort of useful in a city that's growing as fast as Vancouver is. So right now we've got 2.4 million people in the city of Greater Vancouver. We're expecting another 1 million people within 10 years. And that's a huge amount of growth, and the infrastructure needs to change to keep up with that. They've done a pretty good job with transit, but housing in general, we don't have enough housing for that many people, and so these single-family homes are being bought out by developers. This is one of the stations for the underground subway, so they're all over the city, so whenever you see one of these, you know it's a SkyTrain stop. On this street is that most of the single-family homes, they're either for sale, they've been sold, or they're being torn down. And what's happening is that people who bought houses on this street, 25, 30 years ago, bought them for relatively cheap. This was thought of as the suburbs. There's not a house on this street now that's going to be sold under $2 million. Even houses that are not pretty to look at. And what's happening is that these people have started to realize in the last few years that their houses are actually worth, $2 million. But what they've also realized that if they sell their house along with their neighbor's house and their neighbor's house, and they can bundle a whole packet of houses together, suddenly their houses are worth $3.5 million each. And so entire blocks are being bought up, entire blocks are being sold and converted. So on the left side here Park, one of the older civic parks in the city. It's actually, believe it or not, a volcano, but it's a dormant volcano. This is the place which they quarried in order to create the streets, the cobblestone streets that make up the older neighborhood to the right of us. It's actually also the dormant volcano that's got a big water supply there, so a lot of the city's fresh water comes from underneath that mountain. A lot of the real estate practices out here that have come into light recently are sort of shady. And there's been a lot of controversy in the city, basically because it's gotten so expensive. There's actually a building that's being put up just up ahead of us. We're going to pass it in a minute. This is actually the second time it's being built, because the first time it was being built, there's some people who weren't all too happy about it. They came down when it was like 20% of the way through and they burned it down. For example, one of the practices is called shadow flipping. If you're in real estate, maybe you know what that is. What it is the paper came out and revealed that this was happening. Basically, a real estate agent can sell a house maybe for $1 million and make whatever, let's just hypothetically say a 5% commission on it. And then before the people have moved into the house, they can get another offer on the house for maybe 1.2 million. And they can tell those people, hey, we have an offer for 1.2, you can make a quick $200,000. Those people might say yes. And then before those next people move in, the same thing might happen with 1.4. And what happens is the real estate agent ends up selling the house 3 times and making 3 commissions on the same house. And that drives up the price really significantly. And it's actually illegal. You can see all these places, they're all boarded up and they're all coming down. So it's a bit of a ghost town. And what's kind of happening is they want to turn this area into a bit of a more densely populated metropolis. Around the city, that Vancouver is got a very large Asian population. So in downtown Vancouver, about 43% of people are visibly of Asian descent, and there's been a long history of that, kind of dating back to the late 1800s. Chinese people coming over to work on the Canadian Railway, but it's pretty interesting because you get a really diverse community in this area, and you get some things that you might not see in other places. We're gonna pass a church up ahead, and it's a Japanese Southern Baptist church. Don't know where else you'd find that. So the big minority communities out here, it used to be a lot of people from Hong Kong came over in the 80s. More recently, it's a lot of people from mainland China and the Philippines. Those are the 2 biggest minority communities. Here you've got the Oak Ridge Baptist Church with Japanese Sunday services. Part of the reason why all this development is happening is that Vancouver, is kind of silly to say, but we're running out of space. And sometimes I say that and I have people from like India or China on board and they just kind of laugh. but we are actually running out of space. And the reason is this: if you're in downtown Vancouver and you look to the west, you're looking into the ocean. If you look to the north, you're looking at the North Shore mountain range, which is that steep mountains that make up Grouse Mountain and the other ski mountains out there. They're too steep to try to build anything on. Another 20 minutes to the south in the same direction that we're going now, and you hit the US border. You obviously can't build into the US. So theoretically, the only way to build or expand the city would be to go east. But the city on the east is surrounded by all this land that's been set aside as agricultural reserve, land that's been put there in order to feed the city. And because of that, there's not too many directions to go other than up, which is why now Vancouver, even though there's not that many people here, has got the 9th most skyscrapers of any city in the world. They call it the Glass City. And you're going to notice today when we get to Victoria, it's completely different. The architecture is completely much older. First of all, the city is about 100 years older than Vancouver, and so it's far more kind of European looking than Vancouver is. There's not a lot of tall buildings. There's far more churches. Here you can see where the underground SkyTrain actually becomes a real SkyTrain, and the reason it does that, it has to go over top of a river up ahead to get to a neighborhood which is called Richmond, and that's where the airport is. So we're going to be driving through Richmond as well. Renting a car in Vancouver, you might be confused by some of the traffic stuff. Like up ahead you'll see these flashing green lights. They're not normal stoplights, they flash on and off, and tourists are always like stopping. They don't know what to do. Basically what this is it's called a pedestrian controlled stoplight. And so what you'll notice when we go through the intersection of this next stoplight here is that the cars that are coming from the sides here, they actually don't have any lights. They just have stop signs. And so the only way that this light will ever go red is if a pedestrian or a biker comes along and presses the button, which can be really annoying for cars that are trying to get on the road when it's really busy, because they'll never get a chance to. They never get a green light. So what people have started doing now is they've started driving with ski poles, rolling down the window and pressing the button with the ski poles so that the light goes red and they can get across. If we just stayed on this road, by the way, for the next like 3 days, this would be our last stoplight until we got to Tijuana, Mexico. This turns into the I-5 in the United States, and it goes right down through California all the way down to Mexico. This bridge here is going to take us over the Fraser River, which is the largest river in the lower mainland, into a place called Richmond. So this big neighborhood in front of us and to the right of us is called Richmond. And Richmond's a very, very interesting place. Richmond is 55% Chinese. It is the fastest growing neighborhood in Vancouver. And there's a couple reasons why. Part of it is due to foreign investment and immigration. And if you look, what you'll see is that there's cranes absolutely everywhere. They're doing a ton of construction. And a lot of people who know more than I do are kind of shaking their heads and wondering why all this development is happening. They don't think it's a good idea. And the reason that they don't think it's a good idea is this. We're expecting a big earthquake in Vancouver. Like an 8 or a 9 on the Richter scale. It's about 800 years overdue, so we should be okay today. But we're expecting that earthquake to hit. The problem with Richmond is that Richmond is actually below sea level. So the entire place is irrigated by different canals. It's actually 21 different islands that are made to look like one landmass. And so what a few geologists are saying is that when this earthquake hits, Richmond could just liquidify and sink. And so if that happens, it seems like a lot of money to be investing into a project that's going to sink into the ocean. Actually, like I said, 21 different islands. We're on the biggest one of those islands right now. It's called Lulu Island, and Lulu Island came about its name in a very sort of interesting, precarious way. When this whole area was being surveyed and being named, there was a woman who lived on Granville Street who worked at one of the she was a showgirl. She was essentially a stripper, and there was a couple guys who were part of the surveying team who were fairly powerful politically, who were infatuated by her and quite enjoyed going to the place where she worked, and so they actually ended up naming the biggest island out here after her, Lulu Island. It doesn't matter what your job is, you can make a difference. And what Richmond is known for, besides the airport and the huge amount of immigration, they also grow a ton of cranberries. More cranberries are grown out here than anywhere else in Canada, and it is in large part due to the fact that this is all such low-lying wetland, which makes it very fertile for this sort of stuff. There's a lot of other types of berries that grow out here as well, and also all of this forested area to the right of us is all land that's not allowed to be developed. It's actually a bird sanctuary, and so lots of different types of birds in this area. And when we get to the ferry today, we are going to see a lot of wildlife. In particular, we're going to see a lot of bald eagles, probably some blue herons, and lots of marine life as well. We usually see some seals around. This time of year, we've got a chance at seeing some orca whales. We've got 91 local orcas that live in between Victoria and Vancouver, and so they're here year-round, and once in a while we see them on the ferry. I'd say maybe every 10 trips I see one. And then right now as well, there's some transient orca whales that are passing through on their way up to Alaska, as well as some humpbacks and greys that are passing through the area. This little stretch of the highway on the right side here is what the locals call the Highway of God. We're going to pass almost every major religious institution. Churches, synagogues, Buddhist temples, Hindu temples, mosques, Sikh temples. You'll see some of that stuff on the right here. And it's kind of random. There's not really very many people that live out in this area, but seems to be a lot of religious institutions. In particular, the kind of interesting group is the Sikh people. Out here in Vancouver, we actually have more Sikh people than anywhere else in the world outside of India. And just a huge amount of immigrants that came from India in this area happen to be Sikh. And most of them live down in a neighborhood called Surrey. your hometown. An interesting place. It's right close near the U.S. border. Vancouver in general is a very safe city. I think the murder rate in the entire province last year was 18. But that having been said, usually if there's an incident, it happens in Surrey. Would you say that's fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah. And part of it is because of gang violence. It's kind of interesting. Historically, there's been two major gangs in Surrey. One that you've all heard of, the Hells Angels. And then the other one, which is like the most politically correct gang name of all time. They're made up of a bunch of different minority groups. They're called the United Nations. And in recent years, that's kind of been in decline, in part because, well, on the other side of the border, down in Washington, marijuana has been legalized. And so the whole smuggling of it kind of doesn't make that much sense anymore. And then a few years ago, the federal courts of Canada, they deemed that anybody that needed access to medical marijuana for medicinal reasons should be able to have access to it. And then the next day in Vancouver, everybody got really sick, and these shops started to pop open everywhere. So there's now 108 Starbucks in Vancouver. There's actually more medical marijuana dispensaries. You might have seen those around. We're about to go into this tunnel, which actually the river that we went over earlier, the Fraser River, it's got a second arm to it. And that arm is just ahead of us here, but instead of going over it, we're going to go under it. So this tunnel's about a half a kilometer long, and it's going to go 22 meters underneath the river. Two major cities, as well as the United States border up ahead of us, are connected by this tunnel. And there's only 4 lanes. A lot of people need to get to Vancouver in the morning to go to work, and so as you can see, there's a ton of traffic that's heading north. And in the evening time, when we're coming back the other way, they'll have 3 lanes going the other direction because everybody's trying to head south to go home. I was telling you how the city's wrapped by this horseshoe that's all farmland. This is part of that agricultural reserve. It's an area which is called Delta. So in our province, we grow over 220 different types of crops. In this area here, it's a lot of root vegetables as well as berries. You're not going to see any livestock in this area. Typically, the livestock in the province is held a little bit closer to the interior. Or even in the next province over in Alberta, they're kind of known for having most of the cattle and whatnot in their province. And we're 13 kilometers away from where the ferry takes off from, which is a little town called Tsawwassen. It's a strange name. It's a First Nations word, which is First Nations is what we call our Aboriginal people. So the Tsawwassen people have been living out in this area for what we estimate between 4,000 and 5,000 years. They relied heavily on the river and the fish that come from that river in order to survive. In the 1900s in Canada, our government had some very short-sighted and racist policies that took away most of the territory from different groups and assigned them onto what are called reserves. I think Australia has a similar system, and the US as well. And kind of depending on where your reserve was, it had a lot to say about your well-being as a people. The Tsawwassen people, they got relatively lucky because, well, the ferry runs out of their land. The government has to pay a big lease to be able to run the ferry off of Tsawwassen territory. So they make a fair bit of money off of that. The other thing is that there's actually a shopping mall that's just been built in Tsawwassen. It's the second biggest mall in the province, and it was a $300 million project. $300 million of revenue went to the Tsawwassen people. To give you an idea of how much money that is, there's only 300 Tsawwassen people. The chief is 24 years old. He's the youngest chief in the province. So you can imagine that's a fairly easy decision to make when you're offered that much money. I should mention that oftentimes in this province, it is the Aboriginal groups, the First Nations people, who are kind of the strongest and the most resilient force against some of the projects that are environmentally damaging. Like there's a group of people up north called the Skeena people, and they live on an estuary called the Skeena Estuary, which has one of the largest salmon runs in the province. If you know anything about salmon, it's the most important species in our ecosystem up here. Well, these people were offered $1.1 billion to run a pipeline through their estuary by LNG, and they actually turned it down. Being renegotiated, I've heard, but that gives you kind of a sense of how strongly they value their land. There was a bit of an environmental crisis out here years ago where in this area there's a lot of bald eagles, but the bald eagle population was going way down. They were really on a massive decline. And it turned out there was a lady that figured out what happened, and it was a very tricky problem to solve because of the fact that there wasn't any dead bald eagles showing up, and it wasn't like they were losing a significant amount of habitat or food, so it was kind of a strange phenomenon to try to figure out why it was that there was less bald eagles every year. And then she figured it out. What she realized was that there was a pesticide called DDT that they were using out here. And DDT, it wasn't actually killing the eagles, it was just reducing the amount of calcium in their bodies. And so when they were laying their eggs weren't strong enough. They were sitting on their eggs and breaking them. So you had this entire generation of bald eagles just not being born. And they went up to Alaska and they brought down a whole bunch to repopulate the area. Now they're stable again. There's actually a big bald eagle's nest coming up on the left side. There's a big TV antenna pole, and if you look at the top of the antenna pole, you'll see that there's a big nest right in the middle of it. Just on our left side here. Yeah, there's a community near here called the Sunshine Coast, and years ago there was a whole bunch of people's pets that were going missing. Cats and small dogs, and they assumed at the time it was coyotes. Coyotes are usually the most aggressive animal when it comes to pets, but they had a big storm in 2006 and it took down a massive tree on the Sunshine Coast, which actually had a bald eagle's nest in it. And what they found was over 50 pet collars around the tree. So these two bald eagles that have been living in the tree had just been picking off people's pets for years. And actually in Campbell River on Vancouver Island, they had a project that the government sponsored. It was they called it an eagle camp. So it was this live stream of a bald eagle's nest, and you could go online and watch it. And so all these kids were logging on and then finding like Whiskers, the missing cat, up in the nest. So it was a bit of an issue. From my elbow here up to my fingertips, now where my fingertips are, that's where the ferry takes off from. That's about as far west as you can get on the mainland of Canada. Well, my finger here, my thumb, is this kind of awkward peninsula. So it's this road here that we're about to drive over. That's my thumb that goes to the left. If we took that road and we went to the left, we'd actually hit the US border. It's a peninsula that sticks off of Canada, which is called Point Roberts. It's not attached to the United States in any way, but it is part of the United States. So the kids that live there, since there's no schools in Point Roberts, it's too small, they actually cross the border into Canada, drive east, and then cross the border back into the United States to go to school in the morning. A lot of people will go there to buy alcohol or groceries or gasoline because it's cheaper in the US than it is in Canada. I'm sure if you're from the US, you know about a store called Trader Joe's. We don't have Trader Joe's in Canada. It's a very, you know, high quality, cheap grocery store. What we have is this kind of strange man named Mike who started his own store called Pirate Joe's. And he goes over to the U.S. to Trader Joe's and buys up all their stuff. And then he comes back here and he sells it under his own label. They tried to sue him, and for a while he was getting away with it. One of my friends, he actually was forced to hire to be his bootlegger because he wasn't allowed in the store anymore. So he was going over and buying up all these goods and bringing them back. But just this week, after 5 years in court, he's finally been shut down. This is that big shopping mall project that I was telling you about. The big Tsawwassen Mills shopping mall. There's another project on the left there. The main developer behind those apartment complexes is a guy you guys all might know. His name's Michael Bublé. He's a famous musician from Vancouver. He actually used to play at the Holiday Inn on Howe Street. He used to play at the lounge there. One clue that you can kind of use in Canada to know that you're on First Nations land is when you see billboards on the side of the street. The billboards are actually illegal in Canada. You're not allowed to have them. They're thought of as being aesthetically ugly and distracting to drivers. But on First Nations land, they have a right to the land and they can do it if they please. And they make quite a bit of money off the billboards, and so you'll oftentimes find them on the side of the streets. So we're just getting to the ferry now. Up ahead to the right, you're going to see the port. That's the biggest port in Canada. It's called the Delta Superport. And then to the left, if you look in the trees, you'll see hundreds of blue herons. If you look carefully, you'll see them. It's one of the largest blue heron colonies in the province. Part of the reason why they're there is because this artificial peninsula that we're driving along right now, which runs out to where the ferry takes off from, this is man-made. What it did when they made it is it kind of messed with the tides a little bit. What it did is that to the right of us, it created an area that gets really long periods of low tide. And what that means is that it's perfect hunting ground for the blue herons. So the blue herons have set up shop here, and they come out here to hunt. Which means that the bald eagles have come out to hunt the blue herons. The bald eagles will actually get into the nests of the blue herons and they'll take the young right out of the nests. There's actually a big bald eagle sitting on the light post to the left of us here. We're going to pass it in a moment. Just on our left right here. So we're going to have a little bit of time just to relax and hang out before the ferry takes off. We don't have to stay on the bus though. There's a nice little area you can go and check out where you can get a coffee or a bite to eat or a newspaper or something like that. The one thing I'll say about the ferry is it's a great service, but there's definitely places with better food than on the ferry. Not that the food's bad, but in Victoria the food's just excellent. I would say the restaurant quality is higher than Vancouver. And so if you can save your appetite for Victoria, I definitely would. And I have lots of places I can recommend you go. Lots of bald eagles in this area. There's actually another one on the right sitting on the big light post out there.
Oh yeah,
So we are scheduled for the 10 o'clock sailing, which means we'll probably have about half an hour before the ferry gets in and we start having to board. The 9 o'clock sailing, just because we got here so early, is loading right now. We'll just stay on the bus in case they put us on there, but it would be really unusual. It hasn't happened to me yet. But just in case, we'll just stay on the bus for like 5 minutes before I open the doors up. Up to 420 vehicles on it, and it's got two decks for cars, and then this one's got 2 decks for people. The one that we're going to be on is another deck higher even. It's kind of unbelievable, but this company, as big as it is and as expensive as it is, for a car, actually, you pay $60 for your vehicle and then $18 for every single person inside the car. So a family of 5, you end up paying over $150 one way just to get to the island. And yet somehow the ferry manages to run at a loss. They actually don't generate any profit.
Huh.